Hello, and welcome back to Landia Way. I'm Hayden, and today I want to talk about someone who's probably one of the most important people that you've never heard about. His name is Claude Shannon, and if you've ever sent a text, watched a video online, made a phone call, streamed a song, you're living inside of something he helped make possible. But what I think makes Shannon worth an episode wasn't just that he was brilliant. I think many people are brilliant. It's the shape of his brilliance specifically. He could look at a complicated problem and find the simplest structure sitting underneath it. He would strip away everything that wasn't essential to it and ask a cleaner question than everyone else in the room was asking. That cleaner question, once he found it, tended to change all the solutions and the core of the problem downstream of it. That's the idea I want to talk about for this entire episode. I think a breakthrough often comes from reducing a super complicated problem to its simplest possible form. It's not like it's dumbing it down, but it's more finding the specific part of the problem that matters and letting the rest of the complicated parts of the situation fall away. Shannon did this with information itself, though. People had been communicating for the entire span of human history. They had letters, they had phone calls, they had telegraphs, radio, printed books, just talking, for example. Nobody thought that there was anything left to discover about human communication. Shannon, though, asked what communication actually was, mechanically, mathematically. Not what does this message mean to me, but what's being sent. What is information, really? How do you measure it? How much uncertainty does a message remove? How do you send something through noise and still get it back on the other end? That's, I think, the load-bearing idea underneath the entire world we live in right now, because the digital world pretty much runs entirely on moving information reliably, like moving words, moving pictures, moving sound, moving video. All of it has to become something that can be stored, compressed, sent, and rebuilt on both sides of the program. And Shannon essentially wrote the grammar for that system. The move that Shannon made to get there is, I think, one of the most interesting things I came across during my research on Shannon, because he separated two ideas that almost everyone keeps naturally glued together: the meaning of a message and the mechanics of sending it. Normally, when people think about communication, they think about the meaning of the message first, like what the person is trying to say, what the words specifically mean, what's the intention behind each specific word in this message. Shannon set that complicated part of the question aside and asked something more basic. Before we even get to argue about meaning, can the message survive the trip from one place to another? Can it survive interference? Can it be packed up efficiently and unpacked to give the same information on the other end? He wasn't trying to explain the poetry behind the message or the love behind the message or the intention behind the message. He was trying to understand the structure underneath communication at its core. Look beneath the surface, find the system under the result, ask the question everyone else was too close to the problem to think to ask. But I think to really understand the whole idea behind Shannon, you have to understand his past, too. Shannon was born in 1916 in Michigan, and as a kid, he liked mechanical things. He liked radios, wires, machines, puzzles, building stuff to see how it worked. That, I think, part of his childhood matters more than it might seem. Many kids say that they love tinkering, but I think it matters especially as it pertains to Shannon, because Shannon wasn't only a theorist, even as a child. He was a maker, too. He had a engineer's hands attached to a mathematician's mind. And that combination is super important. I think some brilliant people live entirely in the abstract, and some live entirely in the practical. Shannon moved between both of those worlds. Later in life, he became almost as well known for his inventions and his toys as for his theory, which is a really weird thing, honestly, to say about someone who helped build the foundation of the entire digital age today. He built a mechanical mouse that could learn to solve a maze. He built a machine that juggled. He built something people call the ultimate machine, where you flip a switch and a little mechanical hand comes out of a box. You flip the switch up, back off, and it retreats. He rode a unicycle. He was fascinated by chess machines and games and what we now call AI, decades before it was a mainstream sort of idea in the technical world. I don't think that the playfulness of Shannon, though, is like a fun detail in some ways, if that makes sense. I think it's close to the center of the entire idea behind what I'm getting at in this episode. Shannon didn't treat thinking as something that can only happen in a serious professional setting. For him, play was a way of exploring reality directly. That puzzle he creates isn't wasted time. The toys he creates contain real principles. A useless machine can really teach you something about logic or control or learning. I think Shannon, in these scenarios, is a reminder that the person who ends up changing something is often the one who kept playing with a problem longer than anyone else. Not because they were trying to look productive in solving it, but because they physically couldn't put it down. One of Shannon's earliest breakthroughs came from connecting two fields that nobody had really connected directly before: logic and electrical circuits. In grad school, Shannon realized that the logic of true and false, what mathematicians would call Boolean algebra, could be represented physically using electrical switches, on or off switches, mapping into one or zeros or true or false in code. That sounds natural to us now because computers are everywhere and people pretty often understand binary and things like that. But at the time, it was a leap because it showed that electrical circuits could physically perform logical operations, which is basically the seed that computing as a whole grew out of. And keep that pattern in mind because it repeats through everything he did. He saw two things that looked completely different on the surface, a logical statement and an electrical switch in this situation, but they really had the same structure underneath it once you look closely enough. I think that's one of the real marks of great thinking. Not like he knows more than anyone else, but noticing when two unrelated problems are at their core the same problem wearing different disguises. Then, in 1948, came the paper that launched his field, a mathematical theory of communication. Shannon modeled communication as a source sending a message through a transmitter across a channel where noise can interfere to a receiver and eventually to a destination. That model of like a direction for information seems super obvious to us now because it's baked into how we think about any communication system. But making it explicit, like actually writing it down in this book for the first time, was an enormous advancement because once that skeleton is laid out and put there for everyone to use, you can ask mathematical questions on top of it. How much information is in a message? How much can a given channel carry? How much noise is interferent? How do you encode a message so it survives the trip? What's the maximum rate you can send information reliably through a specific channel? Shannon essentially gave the entire system of communication a skeleton. And once that skeleton was visible, he was able to build an entire industries on, or not him necessarily, entire industries could be built on top of it. One of his central concepts, and I think the most useful one outside of engineering, is entropy. In casual conversation, entropy is usually related to disorder, but in Shannon's thought, it's tied to uncertainty. A message carries information to the degree that it reduces uncertainty. If I tell someone the sun rose this morning, that barely tells you anything because that person probably already knows it happened. But if I tell you something that you couldn't have predicted, the message is carrying information. Information in this technical world is kind of like a surprise. It's like the uncertainty being resolved. The more uncertain something was before the message arrived, the more information that message can carry. I think that's a confusing idea in some ways, like the first time you hear it. But once that idea of growing information clicks, it's easy to notice it everywhere. A fair coin contains more real information than a rigged one that lands on heads 9 times out of 10 because there's more uncertainty in the coin flip to begin with. I think there's also a life lesson hiding inside of this technical definition of entropy. A lot of what passes for communication day to day is super low information. People repeat what everyone else in the room that they're in already believes. They say the expected thing because it's socially safe. They agree instead of disagreeing just because disagreement carries risk. None of that reduces anybody's uncertainty about anything. It's just like filling the silence. It's noise. Real communication actually changes what the listener actually knows afterward. It sharpens a picture that was blurry. It removes confusion instead of just adding sound. I think that connects to another one of Shannon's ideas, the distinction between signal and noise. The signal is the real message you're trying to get across. Noise is anything interfering with it, like static on a line, distortion, errors. The engineering problem is how you get a clean signal through a noisy channel. But I think the metaphor behind that is super important just for life. In school, for example, the signal might be understanding, and the noise might be grade anxiety, comparing yourself to everyone else, trying to look smart instead of trying to learn. In sports, the signal might be whatever helps you perform, and the noise could be crowd reaction, ego, overthinking your play, anything like that. And I don't know. In your own head, for example, the signal could be a truth that you don't want to look at directly, and the noise could be an excuse or comparison crowding around it. Shannon studied signal and noise in that sort of strictly technical sense in the way that his brain worked. But I think that so much of life is learning to separate what matters from what's just interfering with it. I mean, and to be clear here, I don't think it means that noise is always worthless. I think there's real information that can be buried inside what looks like noise. But I think the first move always has to be asking what you're really trying to receive, because without that question, everything is equally loud. And once everything's equally loud, you can just be lost inside of a huge, massive sound. What I think makes Shannon's work powerful, and by that I mean it's not just smart, is that he took limits seriously. I think that's the best way to put it. He took them seriously instead of only describing how communication could work in an abstract situation. He asked what was possible given a specific channel. Every channel in his framework had a hard capacity, a ceiling on how much information it could actually carry reliably. And once you try to cram more through it than it can hold, especially with noise, errors start piling up. And I think that's a practical idea once you sit with it, because it applies past his whole communication system of wires and radio waves. A person has an attention capacity. A team has a communication capacity. A relationship has an emotional capacity. A nervous system has a stress capacity. And I think, honestly, that nervous system thing can be related to Andrew Huberman, too, because you can only push cortisol and vigilance so far before the system starts producing errors instead of output. Now, overload any of those channels in relationships, in teams, personal channels, and you get the same result that Shannon would have predicted. More mistakes, not more clarity. I think that's a direct explanation for why some people are constantly busy but never clear about anything. Their channel is overloaded. They have too many commitments, notifications, half-finished conversations that are all competing for the same limited bandwidth, and the signal that they really need to hear can't punch through the noise. I think this connects to a few other people we've talked about as well from a different angle. Seneca would probably say you're spending your attention too casually, handing it out to whoever asks first. Huberman would point you toward sleep and dopamine regulation and say what your nervous system can actually sustain. James Clear would ask what environment is shaping the behavior you're stuck in. I think Shannon gives a different lens on that same problem. Your channel is overloaded with noise, and you're trying to sense something as complicated as life through a system that has hard limits whether you respect them or not. If your attention is fragmented across a dozen inputs, the message of your own life gets harder to hear, even when you're technically receiving more input than any generation in history. Receiving more isn't the same as understanding more. I don't think the right move is always adding another piece of information, because it cuts noise until whatever's true can't be heard. I think that's the most relevant part of Shannon for right now, like today, because we're living inside a world that his theory helped create, and the defining problem of that world isn't access anymore. It's filtering. What matters, what's true, what's loud because the system rewards loudness. Another piece of Shannon's theory, I think, is underrated as a life idea, is redundancy. In communication, redundancy protects a message, because if a message has some repeated structure built into it, even if a part of that message gets damaged by noise, you can often still reconstruct what it said at the beginning. Human language is pretty much full of this. If I write, I am going to the STO blank E, you can guess the missing letter is an R without thinking about it, because the structure around that gap creates enough redundant information to fill it in. Digital error correcting codes like Apple's autofill use this exact principle on purpose. They add extra bits around so that even when noise corrupts part of a transmission, the receiver can still catch it and fix it. At first glance, that redundancy, that filling in the letters, kind of looks inefficient. Why would you want to send extra info? Why build in backup you might never use? But redundancy is exactly what creates reliability. And I think that distinction, efficiency versus resilience, is one of the most useful ideas in this entire episode. A perfectly efficient system has no slack anywhere. It has no margin for error, and it runs amazingly right up until something unexpected happens, at which point it breaks entirely, because there was no room built into the system to absorb the shock. A resilient system instead carries some redundancy on purpose. Think about maybe a team where more than one people actually understands a given process. A student who reveals material more than once instead of trusting a single read-through. A person who has enough sleep and enough enough margin in their schedule that one bad week doesn't take the whole system down with it. I think modern life has a habit of worshipping pure efficiency. Cut every step, fill in every hour, remove anything that isn't being used right now. But life is noisy in the Shannon sense. People get sick, plans fall apart, motivation dips for whatever reason. A system built with zero redundancy lets a single disruption corrupt the entire message. I think that connects to something we've circled through before in this show, that systems should be designed for reality instead of for the fantasy version where nothing goes wrong. I think that idea of a system built for reality leaves a question behind to carry around everywhere. Where do I need more redundancy right now? Not more clutter, but a backup plan. More sleep going into a hard week. More practice reps before something that matters. Some honesty before a relationship gets stretched thin. I think there's also something worth noticing about Shannon as a person, which is that I don't think Shannon has really chased fame at all. A lot of brilliant people want to be seen as important almost as much as they want to be right. Shannon looks like he was mostly driven by curiosity instead, I think. After doing work that reshaped the modern world, he didn't spend the rest of his life promoting that he did that. He moved on to puzzles and to machines and to games and to private tinkering. He followed whatever interested him. And I think there's something refreshing about that way of life, especially now in a moment in the world where so much intellectual work gets tangled up with performing it publicly. I think Shannon's a reminder that curiosity can be its own complete engine, and that not everything valuable has to start with a plan to become known for it. I think the deepest work can just start with someone who can't stop thinking about a question. I think that has a real application on how you learn things as well. A lot of school gets reduced to, is this part of the class on the test? Will this help my application for college? And I think those are fair questions to ask yourself from a reality standpoint, but they shrink what learning can actually mean to you. Shannon represents a different mode. I think he's closer to, what's the structure here? What happens if I connect this idea to that unrelated one? What's the simplest version of this problem I can build? And I think that kind of curiosity that with which his life is built on keeps running, even when nobody's making you do it. And I think giving yourself permission to be interested in something before it's useful or rewarded is a rare skill. Most people wait for permission before letting themselves care about an idea. I think how Shannon lived his life, it looks like he was someone who gave himself that permission directly. And I don't think it's an accident that the person willing to do that saw connections that everyone else walked past. One of Shannon's central habits was abstraction. He would deliberately ignore certain details so a deeper pattern comes into view. When he separated the meaning of a message from the mechanical problem of sending it, that was abstraction. He was saying, for the purposes of this theory, it doesn't matter whether the message is a love letter or a stock price or a military order. What matters is how much information it carries and how it survives the channel. I think that's exactly what made the theory general enough to have it applied everywhere in today's world. But on the flip side, abstraction also always carries a risk alongside its power, because the moment you strip away that detail that's so important for a problem, you could If it goes wrong, strip away something that actually matters to the problem. In Shannon's case, the big shift of communication, dropping meaning was correct and I think completely necessary for the engineering problem he was solving. But if you tried to use that same framework to fully explain human communication, like tone, history, timing, relationship, all the emotional context, that I think you'd miss almost everything that makes a message land or fail or between two real people. So I think the lesson behind his habit of abstraction isn't that abstraction is always the right thing to do. It's that good thinkers carry abstraction as a tool to figure out exactly what they need to ignore for the problem in front of them. And I think that's a subtler skill than it sounds. A bad abstraction could ignore something that mattered. A good one only ignores what didn't matter yet. For this question at this level specifically. Physics, I think, does this constantly. Ignore air resistance, treat the object as a single point, assume a frictionless surface. None of those assumptions are actually true in practice, but they let the core principle of the physics problem become visible. And you can add that complexity back once you understand the shape underneath it. I think the sharpest version of this idea is something like simplify until the structure appears, but stop right before the truth disappears with it. That applies to every hard problem you'll run into. In a real conflict with someone, you might simplify it to, what does this person actually need here? What's the real misunderstanding underneath this argument? But if you oversimplify it to, they're just wrong, then you lose whatever was actually true in both sides of your argument and what was actually useful in the situation. If you're stuck on a subject in school, you might simplify it to, what specific concept am I not getting at in this class? If you flatten it down to, I'm just bad at this, then you lose the path forward that was sitting right there. Good simplification reveals something that is useful to you. Bad simplification hides the same mess that you were trying to solve under a more simple label. I think Shannon was a master at good simplification. On a similar note of information, I think the relationship between information and uncertainty is really interesting the longer you think about it. A message is only really valuable if it tells you something that you didn't already know, which means that surprise, in some sense, matters. But not all surprise is useful surprise. Random noise can surprise you in the sense of just being unpredictable without being meaningful. If I smash random keys on a keyboard and hit send, the result of that is technically unpredictable, but it can't really tell you anything new. Useful information seems to live in a land between total predictability and pure randomness. Too predictable and it tells you something new, but too random and it really means nothing at all. A song that's completely predictable is super boring. A song that's pure randomness is unlistenable. A good song gives you enough structure to follow and enough surprise to make it feel alive. A good teacher connects a new idea to something you've already understood while adding just enough challenge to that it's interesting and that real learning can happen. I think it connects almost directly to the idea of learning in general. If a class is too easy, then there's no information in it, and you already know most of what's being said. If it's too hard, it sounds like noise. You can't decode that challenge fast enough to hold on to it. The best learning really happens right at the edge of your current ability, where there's real uncertainty, but not so much that you lose the thread of the problem. I think this is where Shannon starts talking to Reed Hastings and Amy Edmondson, even though neither Hastings nor Edmondson was talking about information at all. Hastings wanted freedom paired with responsibility, structure plus autonomy at the same time. Edmondson wanted psychological safety paired with high standards, safety plus real challenge held together. Shannon's work says something, I think, structurally similar to them, that any system needs enough order to transmit meaning and enough openness to let new info in at all. A communication theorist at Bell Labs, a hedge fund manager, and a Harvard professor studying hospital teams all ended up pointing at roughly the same shape from three completely unrelated directions. Shannon did most of his defining work at Bell Labs, one of the most remarkable research institutes of the 20th century, which brought mathematicians, engineers, and like the leading minds in all those fields together to work on problems tied to communication and electronics. That environment of Bell Labs, I think, matters a lot more than it gets credit for, looking in hindsight, because Shannon was a brilliant thinker on his own, but he was also surrounded by people in a place that took deep technical work seriously as the main priority for their focus in the job. Genius, in the sense of just being a genius, wasn't purely an individual trait floating in a vacuum at Bell Labs. The right environment gave these geniuses more to work with. They had more people, they had better problems, they had real tools, they had freedom paired with standards. I think that connects right back to Edmondson's research, because even a brilliant mind needs an environment that lets it think clearly instead of just wasting what it's capable of. I also want to spend a minute on one of what I thought was Shannon's weirdest creations, the ultimate machine. There's a box with a switch. You flip that switch on, the box opens, a little mechanical hand reaches out, the hand flips the switch back off, and then it retreats back into the box. That's the entire function of it. It turns itself off the moment you turn it on. It's funny because it's useless, but I think it's kind of profound when you sit with it for a second longer. It's a machine whose only purpose is to undo the thing that activated it. Shannon's playfulness, I think, had a philosophical edge hiding under it. A useless machine can teach you something real about what usefulness even means, because we assume that everything has to justify itself with some obvious function. But sometimes the most useless looking things actually turn out to be valuable because they force you to see something differently. I think that's what modern productivity tends to miss. That not every valuable activity looks productive while it's happening. Play can look pointless right up until it produces an insight or an idea that wasn't expected. I think there's a similar spirit behind Theseus, the mechanical mouse that Shannon built that could learn to navigate a maze and remember that correct path. By today's standards, it's almost simple. But at the time, it was an early physical example of a machine that appeared to learn from its own experience. And Shannon was thinking about intelligence and learning machines decades before that was a mainstream conversation at all. What's interesting, though, is how he approached intelligence through games, through chess, through mazes, through puzzles, through small worlds with rules and goals that let you study thinking in a controlled setting instead of the full, noisy mess of throwing an AI right into real life. I think it's almost another version of the same move he made with the information world itself. If the real world is too complicated to study directly, build a smaller world where the underlying structure is visible. A toy problem isn't childish, it's a smaller, cleaner version of a bigger structure. And I think that's, at its core, a lot of how real learning works. You practice a simplified case before you face the full complexity of the issue. When a problem feels too big to approach, the useful move for actually solving it isn't to try solving it all at once. It's to find the smallest version of it you can work with today. One of the deeper consequences of Shannon's work is that information could be understood independently of whatever medium happened to carry it. The same message can be encoded in electrical pulses, radio waves, symbols, digital bits. Well, the medium of receiving that information matters in practice. The information itself has a structure that can move across all of those forms without losing its meaning. I think we tend to confuse the form of something with the thing itself. Start treating the format as if it were the idea. But the same exact idea can travel through a book, a conversation, a podcast, a formula, and the form shapes how it's received without being identical to it. I think that matters for this show, especially because One Idea Away isn't really about the audio format at all. It's about moving a useful mental model out of one mind and into another. The channel here happens to be audio. The signal, though, Shannon's signal, is whatever idea I'm trying to get across. Noise could be an unclear explanation, a structure that wanders, or me failing to make it obvious why something should matter to you, or maybe just even me going over an idea too heavily, making it boring. Making a podcast, though, is, in a sense, exactly the kind of communication problem Shannon spent his career on. What's the actual signal here? Who's the receiver? What noise might get in the way? A good episode of a podcast isn't just crammed with information, it has a clear, followable signal running through it. You should walk away knowing what idea you just received. Too many unrelated points, and the signal is noisy. Too abstract, and you can't decode it fast enough to hold on to it. No concrete examples, and the message doesn't survive contact with a busy week. It's forgotten. Too predictable, and the episode barely carries anything new. Too random, and it's just noise. A good example in an episode adds redundancy. That's what these episodes try to do structurally. State the idea, tell a story, give a few examples, connect it across different areas of life, push back on it a little, come back to it once more before closing. That repetition of the ideas isn't just filling an episode, it's redundancy doing what Shannon said it needs to do. I also want to talk about compression here for a second too, because I think Shannon's work helped define the mathematical limits on how much a message can be shrunk while preserving what matters inside of it. In plain terms, and just speaking technically, compression is representing the same information with fewer bits. And compression is pretty much the only reason that modern digital life can work at all. But compression is also, I think, a real thinking skill outside of just engineering. A good summary can compress an idea. A sharp quote compresses a worldview. A principle compresses years of lived experience into something that you can share. But I think compression taken too far carries some real danger too. Because if you compress something too aggressively, you can lose info that mattered, like context. A short quote pulled out of context can distort a complicated thinker. A tidy rule can hide every important exception. A label can flatten an entire person into something smaller. In digital terms, there's lossless compression, which preserves the original exactly, and lossy compression, which throws away some information on purpose. I mean, ideally, it's information that nobody would miss. A lot of everyday thinking runs on lossy protection, whether we notice it or not. We summarize people down into a single trait. We summarize a bad test score into identity. I'm just bad at this. We summarize a rejection into being unwanted. I think those summaries feel efficient or maybe correct even in the moment, but they throw away the information that would tell a truer story in the context. I think that also connects to an idea we talked about with René Girard, actually, because a group under pressure will always compress a complicated problem into one scapegoat. Lossy, it's like lossy compression happening at a social level, but it produces the same failure. Something true and complicated gets replaced by something simple and wrong just because simple felt better in the moment. The habit Shannon leaves you with here is asking, every time you compress something, what did I just lose in exchange for this being easier to hold? I think Shannon's legacy is also strange once you look at it directly, because I think most people using the technology built on top of his work have never even heard his name. Computers, telecommunications, error correction, modern networks, they all connect back to information theory in a direct way, in an explicit way, and yet the theory itself has disappeared into the background. I think that's exactly how most foundational ideas behave. If an idea succeeds completely, people stop noticing it's even there. It's just like an infrastructure. It's invisible and essential all at the same time. I think it's interesting that pattern, because it raises a question about what kind of impact you're chasing. Some people want a visible impact. They want their name attached publicly to the thing they built. They want to be famous. Other people build a concept or a framework that becomes the shape everyone else's future work gets poured into. And their influence is much less visible, but arguably much more important. I think Shannon's is quite possibly the most clear example of the second kind. He didn't just solve one problem, he built a framework that made thousands of future problems solvable by people who could never even read his original paper. I think that echoes an idea that Naval Ravikant talks about when he describes leverage through code and media and capital, except Shannon's leverage was entirely conceptual. It was a piece of math that multiplied its value across dozens of unrelated industries because the underlying structure was universal. I don't want to end here, this episode, without naming where Shannon's framework has a limit, because, I mean, every idea does, and pretending that it doesn't would work against the whole point of this episode. The risk of thinking heavily in terms of information is that you start treating everything as if it were information, and human life obviously isn't just that. A poem isn't data. A person isn't a stream of signals. I mean, meaning matters in ways that a technical theory can't capture, and was never trying to capture. And I think Shannon himself was even explicit in that his theory was about communication in a technical sense, not in meaning at all. Two messages containing the same number of bits can mean something completely different to the person hearing it. I love you and I never loved you probably carry a similar information load in megabytes, and it tells you nothing real about what either sentence would do to someone hearing it. So, I don't think Shannon's goal was ever to flatten life into information. The goal is really to use his ideas where they reveal something, in the same way that Girard's lens is useful for seeing imitation without every desire being just metic. In the same way that Clear's lens is useful for seeing habits without every problem being reduced to a habit problem. I think the mature move with any of these powerful frameworks is keeping them in your tool belt to use as a lens without being trapped inside of that framework for life. With that limit in mind, though, what Shannon leaves you with is a useful set of questions to carry around with you everywhere, not just in engineering. Find the simplest structure underneath a problem before adding more complexity on top of it. Separate the signal from whatever's just loud. Respect the real capacity of your attention and your relationships instead of assuming that you can overload them forever without any problems or errors accumulating. Build real redundancy into whatever needs to be reliable. Use compression carefully and ask what got left out every time you reach for a summary or labeling something. Protect curiosity even when it doesn't look productive. Ask what uncertainty you're actually trying to resolve before collecting more information for its own sake. And finally, care about what arrives on the other end. Not just what you meant to send, because a message that you might understand perfectly in your own head still has to survive the whole trip into someone else's before it means anything at all. I think that's really what Shannon's world is when you boil it down. Signals moving through noise, messages encoded, decoded, uncertainty resolved little by little. I think it really sounds super technical because that's what Shannon's world was. But it also describes a universally true idea about being alive. Because we're always sending and receiving signals from other people, from the world around us too, from our own bodies. And there's always noise in the way of that. Distraction, ego, comparison, bad timing. The challenge wasn't ever receiving more information. It's learning to hear what actually matters. Thanks for listening.